Well, so thank you, and let me start by thanking Marianne, Betty, and the Anthro department for having me here. I'm a little bit overwhelmed of like being here and realizing what does this mean. But it's also nice to be back to Gainesville and all these memories I keep from here. My husband is here. We met here 25 years ago or so. So it's also a celebration for us. And it's good to see so many of the good friends, Tony, Karen's here. So thank you all for coming. And I hope I stand to the task with this talk. So today I'm going to be talking about this project, it was funded by the European Research Council, which is like a big funding of the European research arena. And it's on climate change impacts on indigenous people and local communities. And the main goal is to have this global perspective based in these local studies, right? So that's the main idea of how do we get this global understanding when you start from this very anthropological or field-based studies. And I just want to emphasize that everything, well, I mean, I take responsibility for what I say, but it's also, I want to recognize that none of this has been done by myself alone. There's like this big LICCI consortium that you have the names here, and all this is kind of like collaborative work. I'm going to be presenting many of the research that my students or my collaborators have done. I try to put always like the names of the main researcher on the slide. So if you want the references, I can give them to you. I can pass them to you. So this is what I'm going to be presenting is based on these local indicators of climate change impact project. And the main goal was to look at the contribution of local knowledge to climate change research. You have the web page here. So everything, all the materials, the protocols, the case studies, everything is there, right? So what was this project about? So as I say, we wanted to see, if you forget, if you leave this room and you don't remember anything, at least try to remember that one slide, that one idea, is that how exploring local knowledge can contribute to a global understanding of climate change impact. So there is all this idea that like, okay, indigenous people, every case or local communities, every site is different. But despite that, there are some global learnings that we can have for global policy. So what was the motivation of this? And this project is like a 5-year project that involved 50 case studies. I'm going to be talking more about that. So it was like this big kind of like consortium research, right? So what was the motivation? No? So the main idea of this project is this idea that climate change, okay, it's a global phenomenon, but the impacts are different depending on where do you live, what are the environment where you live, what are the socio-economic conditions where you stand. So even if the climate change is global, it's different for everyone. Another of the points of departure of this project was that the changes in the local climate, are people can perceive them. And there was a big debate in the literature, like, oh, people don't have the instruments to actually see what's changing. And the point of departure of this project is not, no, there are changes in the biophysical and in the human environment, and people who have an understanding of the places where they live are able to see those changes, right? Because they have these long-term interactions with the environment. So that was, and these changes can be just the glacier melting, less water in the river, birds don't come, the crop productivity is lower. So that was the third kind of like idea here is that people, indigenous people and local communities that have this long-term relationship are in a good position to understand and to see those changes because they have these complex knowledge systems, this traditional ecological knowledge. I mean, they have different names for that, but like complex knowledge systems that allow them to see those changes and to understand them and to see what is making those changes, right? And they also have responses for those. So that was kind of like the main setting or motivation to start this project. And one of the research gaps that we wanted to fill from an anthropological side was like, okay, we have a lot of information of climate change, but if you look at the information for climate change and the modeling, it comes from weather stations, right? So you take the weather stations and then they do extrapolations, and then they say, okay, that's how it's going to be the climate here. It's going to be hotter. It's going to be rain more. But all this is based on weather stations. And when you look at the map of the weather stations in the world, you see like the parts darker are the ones where more weather stations that are used for these climate models. So you see that there are many parts in the world where there are no weather station or no weather stations that are used for the modeling. So when they have to do modeling for the Amazon, they just use whatever data is there. And the less data you have, the more possibilities is that your model is not going to be very precise just because you don't have the data, right? But there is people there, right? So that was the point of this project. So there is people that have knowledge, and we can learn about these impacts through other knowledge systems that is not necessarily the weather station. So it's not a competition or anything with weather station. It's not saying this is not valid or not. It's just saying, okay, we can fill more of the information with other data. The other point, or the other point that we want, that where this project is built is this idea that there are many, we are not inventing local perceptions of climate change impacts. There are many, many studies, and particularly since we started the project, after it has grown, everyone is looking at perception of climate change impacts, but everyone is looking through their own methodologies, through their own lenses. So what you learn with the Chiman and the Bolivian Amazon is not, you cannot compare to what you learn from the Tuareg in the Algeria, right? Because they use different methodologies, and you get to maybe the same conclusions, but you cannot really put them together in a systematic way. You can put them together in some ways, but not in a systematic. So we wanted to kind of like create a protocol or create a way in which you can bring together systematically information from different case studies. So with all this kind of like, okay, this is the background of the LICCI project, what we wanted to do, the main objective of this project, was to explore the potential of local knowledge to contribute to this global understanding. As I say, this is kind of like, I'm repeating that because that's the main idea. And also like this idea of, are there patterns? So from what we learned from the different kind of like case studies, are there patterns regarding these locally observed climate change impacts? Are people observing the same things, or are not observing the same things, but like, can you say something about, okay, people in the arid areas or in the mountain areas, or women see different things than men, or fishers see different things? So are there patterns that we can identify of how people observe changes in the environment? That was kind of like one of the objectives more theoretically, but then we also have more applied objectives. One of them was to bring all these insights to the international climate change policy, because this is one of the issues also that in the climate change arena, like the decisions are being done by policymakers or by people who are not necessarily, indigenous people cannot bring their voices always, all the time to this arena, no? So how do we bring it was a little bit the idea of like, by speaking, by bringing this knowledge, or by putting this knowledge in a way that policymakers that are negotiating all these climate issues in a language that they understand, maybe we can have an impact. So that was part of another goal, more applied. And the final goal was to create this network of people, researchers, but also like practitioners interested in this indigenous and local knowledge and climate change. So that was also one of the goals, to create this as a consortium, right? Where interactions are not always from the main researcher, but also like there are things that escape my influence, and that was good. It was always value that people will publish things without me, or like start collaborations without the core team. So that was also one of the goals. At the methodological level, we based the project in this, I don't know if you have heard of this approach, the multiple evidence-based approach. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It was developed by the IPBES kind of like family. And the idea of this approach is that reality is this complex oval there, and it's just complex, and every discipline or every knowledge systems can only apprehend one part of it, right? And so every, like one of these lines is a discipline, like you have the disciplines in blue and you have other knowledge systems in red or orange. And it's kind of like, if you look at the reality from a biological point of lens, you see one part. And if you look from an anthropological lens, you look, and if you look as an indigenous person, you see other things. So there are, if you use multiple evidences, right, you can have like a more enriched picture of what reality is, and there are complementarities and synergies, and there are also contradictions, so you also have to look at them. And the point also was like, we are not verifying knowledge, like, okay, is what indigenous people say, is this true with science? That's not the point. Every knowledge systems have their own verification systems, and like we are like bringing them together to understand, but letting each knowledge system speak for itself, no? And yeah, so I mean, this idea of placing the diverse knowledge systems at the core of the climate research to enlarge the scope of evidence, no, of what's happening, and to draw generalizations, right, to kind of like bring policy to what matters to people, not only to what scientists doing modeling see, but also bring it to policies, to what matters to people. So that was the kind of like the theoretical methodological approach. It was a very kind of like complex global project which was based in collaboration and networks. So the structure of the project, we had a core team that was the team here in Barcelona, right? This was like the team, the 10 people or 15 people working in the development of the methods, in coordinating data collection, in doing the data curation, right? In some of the global papers. And then we had this global network of partners who were partners that were all over the place. And we tried to kind of like select people who already had contacts in a site. So the idea was like, okay, let's piggyback on people who have already good contacts. I mean, I cannot train a team to go and do research in 50 sites, right? But I can, like if Marianne has a student in the Bolivian Rio Branco, I can say, okay, can I train your students to collect this little data set for me? So that's what we did. We had like these 50 researchers that were researchers, and also some of them were NGO people, but were interested in climate change, coming to Barcelona, getting some training, the training to get the systematic data collection, and going back to the field sites and collect data using this protocol. So it was based in this collaboration and this networking. So these people knew each other, and then they decided to do something on the Amazon. And then so that was this partner network. And then we also tried this, I mean, you could say it's a failure, or you could say we had some learning. We tried to do also like an open citizen science platform where other people who are not LICCI partners could also enter observations of climate change in this platform. And I mean, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, a little bit at the end. And I can tell you why this is a failure or this is a learning experience, right? So that was kind of like the whole component. We use, as I say, the point was, how do we collect local data that is locally meaningful? So you don't go there with a questionnaire that you have developed sitting in Barcelona and it makes sense for you, but you go there and like people are looking at you, it's like, what is this? So we wanted to do something that is locally meaningful, but that was cross-culturally comparable, right? So we could, after, take things together and run our numbers or our analysis, right? So as I say, the main concept was, okay, let's do this network where we work with local partnerships. So we selected these 50 cases, mostly is some grad students who were spending a year in the field, and we kind of like knew that these people were going to be there have some connections, or people working in NGOs in local sites. And there was like a lot of like the participant observation and getting involved with the people. So we didn't want to parachute or send people collect the data. The data for this can be collected in a month, right? But we didn't want people to collect data in a month. We want people to be there and collect the data eventually. So that was one part. This is kind of like the distribution of the sites. At the end, ideally the sites, the selection of people was, okay, let's select people who are working in the 5 climate zones. So the tropical, arid, temperate, snow, polar, right? So 10 people in each site, and then people with different livelihood strategies. So people who are fishers, hunter-gatherers, agricultural, pastoralists, right? Agro-pastoralists. So that was the ideal. Then with the applicants that we have, we selected what best approach or ideal. And then COVID came and the whole thing collapsed. And we did whatever we could. So at the end, we have like these 48 sites, which are quite well representative. But you could say, for example, in the US, we have 2 or 3 cases. But then when COVID hit, the people couldn't finish. And then you have personal issues, right? Like, I mean, some postdoc who eventually couldn't continue the data collection because he married. And after the year of the COVID, people have changed their thing. No? So, but that's the distribution. And there are some zones that are not well covered, but still, it's not that bad. And then we had like the protocol for data collection. As I say, we wanted to do something locally meaningful. So there was a lot of, you're not supposed to comprehend the whole schedule, but it was just to show that we devote a lot of time to qualitative data collection. So there was a lot of like initial semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, understanding the local, in every one of these 50 sites, right? You have to do some interviews to understand what's the language that people are using to talk about change, what is the consensual understanding of what things are changing, and then focus group to verify, no? So we have like these interviews like, okay, what things are changing? And someone say, oh, the winds are coming from the west, the winds are coming from the east. So people will tell you, and then different things, and then we have this focus group to say, okay, are the winds coming from the east or from the west? Things that were contradictory, and then people will say, oh, in summer, they're coming from the east, and in winter, or they will say, oh, no, he doesn't know because he's from another community. And but we had all this process of kind of like trying to do locally meaningful data, and that was like the first part. And then so one of the things we did, and you are not able to read that, of course, but you can look at this in the LICCI webpage. There is this thing that we call the LICCI tree. This collection of local indicators, that was what we call the local indicators of climate change. People will say, oh, flowers are not, this tree is not flowering anymore. The river, I don't know, the grass, we cannot cross the river because it's whatever, all these things. We kind of classify them in what we call this LICCI tree, that if you go to this web page, I mean, you can click, no? And we have like this, is this a change in the atmospheric system, in the biophysical system, in the biological system, in the physical system, in the livelihoods, right? And then if it's in the atmospheric system, it's a change in temperature, precipitation, air masses, or seasonality. And if it's a change in temperature, is this mean temperature, seasonal temperature, or so and then in mean temperature, you have all this. So this list here were like what we call the LICCIs, right? The local indicators of climate change impacts. So every observation of change that people have told us, somehow we were able to classify in this tree, which is like 300, I think, LICCIs. It took us like 10 people thinking over that for over a year or more, and then at the end you collect the data and you still have to modify it because that's how reality is. But it was a very useful thing because that's what allows us to reach the local, meaningful information with a cross-culturally comparable data, right? Because someone is telling you the elephants don't come anymore, and someone is, right, in the, I was gonna say in the Amazon, but no, there are no elephants in the Amazon. In the Congo, someone is telling you, and then someone in the Arctic is telling you the fishes are not, but then you have this LICCI that is changes in behavioral, in the ecology of mammals, and you can bring together observations that are in different kind of like ecosystems or in different parts. You can bring them together to be able to compare them later. So this LICCI tree, it's kind of like one of the important things I think that we have developed, right? And then at the end, we had structured interviews based in all this work that it's very anthropological, I will say, locally based, understandings, the language of the people, the interests of the people. Then we construct these questionnaires, these surveys, that is where we can base our more quantitative work. Okay, so 20 minutes and no results yet. So what is this results about? Let me skip that. That was, so I'm going to be talking about the results now. And so all this complex kind of like setting, I'm going to be talking about three main results, or three main questions that we have is how do indigenous people and local communities experience, understand, and describe climate change impacts, how these indigenous people and local communities respond and adjust to all these impacts. And then also what have we learned as a researchers of this process of weaving local knowledge and climate change, right? I mean, what have we learned as a researcher, not scientifically, but like more an introspective understanding. Okay, so the first finding is that indigenous people and local communities, and this is kind of like our not main, but like one of the main findings, they report numerous, ongoing, tangible, situated climate change impacts and their cascading effects. And this provides a holistic view of change. So in all these 52 sites, there was no site where people say, oh no, everything is the same. No, everyone sees changes. Everyone sees changes. All these changes are profound. And this is important because sometimes we just give it for granted. And no, we have to say it clearly. People are seeing changes and they attribute them to climate change, and this affects their lives. And those changes, we have like this, I mean, this is a representation. These changes are in the atmospheric system. So people report changes in the glaciers, in the rivers, in the temperature, but people also report changes in the life system, right? So the farmers in Australia, they observe changes in the wildland distributions of the meadows, because there are rising temperatures, and then there is agricultural changes in the Yunnan in China, and then there is, right? So in all the sites that you go, people tell you changes in the atmospheric system, in the life system, and in their livelihoods, right? And this is kind of like a holistic view. And when you put, and so we have like these specific case studies. So if you go to the LICCI webpage, and we have published a book also, an edited book, where not all the partners, but many of the partners describe the changes in their side. So you can go and say, okay, so what do the Basaris say, or what the Yunnan people or the Aka people in Yunnan in China say, or what? No, so you can have these field descriptions of the sites, but then we were out, because of the LICCI tree, we were also able to put those together, and then you can see, okay, so from all the changes that people say, what are the most changes that they are most often reported, no? And for example, here you say, okay, so people see more changes in the atmospheric system and then in the life system, right? More than the physical system. And in the atmospheric system, what they report, and this is very interesting, I think, it's changes more in precipitation than in temperature, right? So we always talk about global warming, but people are more concerned about global drying, maybe, or like, it's not drying because not all the changes are on drought, but it's changes in the precipitation regimes. And that's how, I think that's also important, right? And then, for example, in the life system, many of the, this was a big discussion in the life system. Do we have wild, like domestic, like our crops in the same part of the lychee tree than than but at the end, but we decide like life system is wild and cultivated nature around. So plant cultivation is like the main change report. So people are reporting, that's the main thing people observe across the 50 sites, no? People are concerned about changes in how climate is affecting their agricultural systems. So this is one of examples of like how bringing all these different observations from different sides, you can pull them together and say something that it's kind of like more global, right? Another of the examples of this is when we ask about, okay, so people say changes like these trees are growing, or this fruit is smaller or bigger. So we observe that most of the changes that people report in the biological system, and this is something that's going to appear soon in conservation biology, is in the abundance, phenotype, phenology, distribution. So people report all these things, but when what it's important is that when you look at the species that people tell you, these are species that are not reported in the IUCN list, right? So people are talking, and this is, I mean, this is not to say that the IUCN list is wrong, or it's just to say that people are looking at other things that scientists or that biologists are not looking at. And this is kind of like, okay, I mean, if you want to do things that really matter to people, you need to know, it's not that the others are not affected, but it's that when you ask people, okay, what's changing, they're telling you these plants that maybe are not threatened, or we don't know because we're not looking at them, no? But most of the species reported, the species in green are the ones that are not reported in the IUCN list, right? From all the species that we look at them. So they are just, we don't know if they're threatened. We don't know from the scientific point of view. We know that, but what we know is that the scientists are not looking at the same species that people are seeing change, right? So there is some synergies there that can grow, right? One of the things I was talking with Renata about this finding in our talk this morning, no? One of the interesting also things that we saw with this kind of like global analysis is that we had, just by chance, we had like this question in the surveys, we had these questions on quality of life, right? And a colleague of mine, Eric Galbraith, had this idea of like, okay, let's look at whether these people are happy, their subjective well-being compared to, in general, right? To the World Happiness report. And if you see in this graph here, like the blue dots are the dots in the World Happiness Report, and you can see how in the world it seems that the higher your income, the happier you are. Your life, your subjective well-being is growing, right? And if you see in the orange one are the LICCI sites, some of the sites that, so people in these places, despite having low income, have very high kind of like subjective well-being, life satisfaction. And that was something that we published in PNAS, and we were very happy. And then I say, okay, let's look at that compared to the LICCI. So the more, like, I wanted to know whether the more, I call this the Greta Thunberg hypothesis, the more you perceive change, climate is changing, is this affecting your subjective well-being? And that's the graph on your right. Thank you. I'm totally dyslexic. And you can see that, I mean, and we found that communities that perceive more climate change have lower subjective well-being, despite the fact that they are very, very happy overall, right? So there is also some thinking there for us to do. Like, I mean, okay, climate, the perception of climate change impact seems to be really affecting these communities in a profound way, despite the fact that in general they might have subjective well-being. So that's another example of like, and this, we have this work under review now, another example of like how you can bring in together. So because these perceptions of climate change impact was based on this index of the LICCI, how much of these climate changes you perceive, right? Another of the findings of this kind of like of the answers of these questions, how do indigenous people experience and describe climate change impacts, was also this is a case in Senegal with the Basari. And one of the findings that I thought it was interesting, because it's like, okay, I should have known that, is that indigenous people, they don't describe climate change impacts by itself. They describe them associated with the social, the political, the ecological context, right? And of course, if I'm saying that now, it's like you are like, okay, yeah, of course, that makes sense, right? But when you set up the project, it's like, okay, what are the climate change impacts? And then people are saying, well, it's not climate change impacts. For example, in this case, this student, she wanted to look at crops that are drought resistant, because she said, okay, she's working in an area where it's going to be more drought. And she said, okay, so why people are abandoning these drought resistant varieties? If there is an expectation that this is going to be more and more drought, you should be keeping those varieties. And then when her research was like, okay, there are political drivers. So there's like all these development projects that come and say, oh no, don't plant sorghum and bambarana, plant rice and maize, right? And then how these extension programs, the market, the dietary changes make that people changes those things. So when you ask them, okay, what is changing? Why is drier? Why don't you keep growing your varieties? They are saying, oh, because this is less workload, or this is easier to cook. No, the rice is easier to cook than the bambarana. Right? So if you make a program to say, okay, let's save the drought-resistant varieties, and you don't take into account that these people don't want to spend so much time cooking, that they don't want to keep the kids, for example, with some of these varieties, like, oh, the kids have to go and throw out the birds that come and eat the. So now the kids cannot do that because they go to school, no, right? So the changes for them are integrated, and you cannot really talk about climate change impacts from this very narrow perspective that we have. And this is kind of like a mental map that we did with the research with the Chimane, showing that, right? Because the question we asked was, okay, what changes in the environment have you seen? And they will say, oh, there is less, the crops are not growing. Why is that? Because we wanted to see attribution, right? You see changes, but do these changes are due to climate change, or why are these changes? And then with any of these, in green, you have the changes in the environment, with in the biophysical environment. The blue are the biological environment. The blue are the physical soils and water, and the black is the temperature and precipitation, and red is more the technological, the political, the economic, the land use change, right? So when you put together what people is telling you is this matrix, right? It's not that the crops are not growing because it's less rain. They say, yeah, but it's also, there is more people, there's population growth, and we have less land. And it's also because they are deforesting and we have less rain. I don't know, I mean, they just tell you all these things, and when you put them together, you see that understanding this climate change for people, climate change is only one of the drivers, and there are like all these other things that drive environmental change, and these also have implications of the policies we want to do, right, with the community. And okay, so I mean, maybe I'm just gonna run a little bit further now, but this is kind of like an example of how when you of the same thing, right? But in the web page, we have examples of that with the local voices. We try to bring the local voices, and what I have said you now, for example, people will, when we say, okay, what things have changed? And in this case of the Chimane, the climate change is one of the part, but there's land use change and there's cultural change. So people will tell you, for example, for the climate change, people were telling us, oh, the plants now cook on the ground, no? The ground is very hot, then it rains, and then it's hot again. So the seeds cooks and the plants don't grow, right? But they also say, okay, what other changes? They say, okay, people are not hunting now respectfully, no? So now I found that a deer that was shot, but nobody went to get it. And then Jajaba, which is like the spirit, right, who guards the animals from the Chimane, got angry because you didn't go and finish shooting the animal and eat it. So now Jajaba is not sending us animals any longer, right? So this is their voice of like saying, okay, why is this changing? This is changing because there is a punishment for the environment also from that, no? So we kind of like try to bring their voices on the, so it's not only like the description I'm giving, but also trying to bring the voices of people to describe this complexity. So I think this is the final slide I have for this third part of how Indigenous people experience and understand climate change. So another of the findings that we have is that the reports, and I think this is important, of environmental change are not uniform. And maybe that's not the best slide that I have, but these two slides are supposed to be are in the same place in Sierra Nevada, in a place in the south of Spain. And we were asking about climate change impacts, and then this student divide the set of people between experts, meaning people who work with the environment, or we are agriculturalists, pastoralists, and that's one of the one network, and the other is the non-experts. So this is like people who have a shop or who have trades or motorcycle, no, and do other professor, other jobs, right? And when you compare the two networks, and maybe it's not so visible here, but the number of links or the number of identifications of changes of the experts is much more than the ones of non-experts. So when you get to, and this is also seems obvious, no, but when you get to a community and ask people, okay, what are the changes that you observe? The changes that people are going to tell you depend on how these people relate to the environment and how you are situated in relation to this, the relationship with nature. Okay, so in summary of this big, what's the answer to this question? How do Indigenous people and local communities experience, understand, and describe climate change impacts? The main three things maybe to remember is that Indigenous people and local communities report, as I say, numerous, ongoing, tangible, situated climate change impacts and cascading effects, right? And this gives this holistic view. Indigenous people and local communities recognize climate change as one of the drivers of environmental change. So you cannot separate this from the other things. And the reports of people are not uniform. So it depends if you're talking to one person or the other, the reports that you're gonna get. So that's the first question. Then we also, the second part of the second question we wanted to look at is how these Indigenous people and local communities respond and adjust to these changes. So, okay, they do see changes, what do they do? And most of this is due to this work, the work of this Anna Schlingmann, who was, I mean, and I want to give credit to her here now, my idea was like, okay, what people perceive. So my idea was the first time, and she was like, but also adaptation, no, what people do, what are responses, no? So she brought this part into the project, and I'm very grateful to her for that. So what do we found here? She was looking at adaptation measures or response measures to the impacts, no? So basically we asked, the first question was, okay, what changes do you see? What generate those changes? And then we asked, and what do you do about those changes, right? So we had all these kind of like responses of like, okay, I change crops. I build my house in a different place to avoid the flooding. I did nothing. I borrow money, I know. So you just have like all these different kind of responses. And I mean, one of the main general findings is that many of the indigenous and the local knowledge that people have enable these context-specific responses. So many of the responses that people are giving are kind of based on their knowledge and depend on the political, economic, and sociocultural context, right? So here you have like all this variation. So there is not uniform response. People are not responding differently, but the responses are based on the context in which they live. But one of the important things of this is that regardless of the response, the cost is for the people. And this is something that people sometimes in the discourse on adaptation is not emphasized. all these responses, if you have to change crop, if you have to move your house to a different place, if you have to migrate, all this is a cost for people. And sometimes in our countries, or at least you think the state will provide to help you in adaptations. But in many of those contexts, people are adapting and bearing the cost, right? So we were looking, this master student from this marine sand, she was looking at all the range of adaptations responses. One of the points that she made, that she found, one of the things that she found is that most of the responses are incremental. Some people, when they see the changes, but they do little adjustments. So they will change the crop, or they will change the moment where it's not raining, so I will put the seeds 2 weeks later, right? So they are changing, or I'm changing my seeds, or I'm bringing irrigation. That's already, so they have like all this gradient of how much you actually have to change, from incremental to what they call transformational responses, So she has this gradient, from revitalize, or like revitalizing, maintaining, changing a little bit, to like the red one there is kind of like permanent, far away relocation, start a new activity. I was a hunter, I was an agriculturalist, and now I'm fisherman, right? So you have to completely change. And most of the responses are incremental. And this was a conversation with Renata this morning. It's like, okay, is this adaptation? Well, maybe it's not adaptation, it's a response. People are responding to a shock or to a change that they see, and we don't know if it's adaptation, or it might be a response in the short term, but how does this result in the long term? And very little of them are transformational, that you have to actually change your income generation or switch to a different activity. But those ones also have more cost. And again, those costs are not only, I'm not talking about economic costs, also like cost, cultural costs, right? You have to relocate, you have to change your lifestyle, right? And they are bearing those costs. We also found in this kind of like global analysis of like responses that the implementation, and this is work of this Anna Slingman, that we have it under review now in global environmental change, that the implementation of adaptive measures do not correlate with the LICCI. So we have this measure of how much climate change every person perceives, right, based on these surveys. So you have like a note, a grade, like you perceive. So we first collected climate change perceptions, and then we say, have you seen changes in the agriculture? Have you seen changes in the rain? And based on that, we were able to evaluate how much every individual perceived climate change. And then we look at the adaptations. So in theory, the more you see change, the more you should be responding or adapting. And we found that no, it just poorly correlates, right? And that was like, okay, so people are not adapting. And okay. And then she was looking at why, when she say, are you, okay, it's flooding, have you moved your house? And they say, oh no. And say, why? Right? Because that's an adaptation. The have you moved your house came from the interviews also. So we were asking for adaptations that someone else in the community was saying. It's like, oh, but your neighbor move your house, so why not? And then people were saying things like, and this is kind of like the list there, no? I don't have the money, or I don't have anyone to help me, or I don't, some people were saying, I don't see the flooding, right? Or so what are the constraints? I don't have the time, I had to go work and I couldn't change the moment where I could see the plants. So we see that all these constraints that people, what prevents people from taking these adaptations is very diverse and is very context specific, right? So, I mean, it's this mess there that you are not supposed to understand just to see that everyone is telling you different thing. But what we found later is that despite this diversity, households that perceive climate change and have not taking these adaptive measures are also households that have fewer access, low social capital, and low food and water security. So there is a material aspect for this lack of adaptation. People don't have the yeah, the social capital, the money. And so again, this is one of like, we recognize the diversity of like every specific case, and we are looking at every specific and analyzing, but we are also trying to find these more general patterns, right? So maybe I'm just gonna skip this summary, and I'm just gonna move to the last part of the presentation, that are these reflections of the process of weaving knowledge with climate change. And so we have like 3 main reflections here, and I'm just gonna try to be faster. First, that the understanding of climate change impacts that derive from different knowledge systems do not always overlap. And this is important because as a scientist, we always try to justify that the people know. And in this case of the Tuareg in Algeria, when we see the changes, when we ask about the changes, all the changes that they were telling us about the cycles, the temporal cycle, like the cold season is coming later, the feathers, I mean, yeah, the changes in the season, all this correlated more or less with the scientific understanding. But when we were looking at the temporal changes, longitudinal changes, that was not. So people were not seeing changes in rains over the years, or so, and that's okay, right? We need to embrace this diversity and not pretend, oh, they don't see what the science, they're wrong because they don't. So that was kind of like a first thing, that when we work with different knowledge systems, we have to be open, that there's no overlap, and we don't have to try to bring it together. We also kind of like, it was very important for us to understand that there are different conceptualizations of the indigenous people. And for me, this sentence of the Yanomami leader, the David Kopenawa, like, for me, climate change is the revenge of the earth. This is like, okay, that's what it is. I mean, so forget about climate. I mean, forget about the temperatures and this. The earth is taking revenge against us because we are not taking care. And it's coming from a relational perspective of like, we are not relating to the earth in the way, and we have to embrace these different conceptualizations. Another of the realizations of these reflections of this is how all the problems we found in trying to feed the indigenous people and local communities' rights with our research practices. Our institutions are not prepared to kind of like support what indigenous people and traditional local communities are asking us about consent, knowledge sharing, right? We have all these, okay, you have to put all the data on the internet, and it's like people are saying, oh, we need to protect our data. So how are our institutions, like we have in Europe, these protocols about all the data you collect has to be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. So we are forced to put our data on the open. And indigenous people are saying, no, we want to keep controlling our data. We want this data not to be for private benefit, but for collective benefit. We have to use it with responsibility for our communities. So how do we prepare our protocols or our institutions to actually uphold the rights of indigenous peoples? And here, this was, and I don't know if you have used Dataverse, but Dataverse is kind of like this big place where people are putting data now. Like, I mean, we are supposed to put these platforms, right? Where you put data on the open so other researchers can use it, which is kind of like fair. Okay, that's fair. But how do we actually prepare that open source research to actually uphold the rights of indigenous people? And we were working with some of them to actually transform these open source repositories in a place where actually you can put data, but people are, before using it, have to go back to indigenous people and re-ask for consent, etc. So just this thinking, not that we have solved it, but how we advance the thinking of doing our research. So the whole point here is like, okay, it's not what research you do, it's also how you do it and where do you stand for in terms of like the indigenous people communities that you work with. And the final reflection, and this is something that was like, oh, wow. In our research, we overlooked the environmental impact of our research. And this was a project on climate change. And we did this analysis of like, okay, how much CO2 have we emitted? Only in the first phase of the project, we emitted 120 tons of CO2. only for building this network, bringing all these researchers to Barcelona and do all this. So this is the estimation. Then we did an estimation of how can we have reduced that to reduce to a little bit, or what will have implied for the research to do a net zero emission scenario. So we did some scenario working, and actually with not that much work, we could have reduced, that's like the orange line, we could have reduced to by 30% very easily, just changing some of the research practices rather than running all these big workshops in Barcelona, running them, one in the Amazon, one in more locally, so people have to travel less. So if you think about the impact of your research, not that you are gonna get net zero emissions was harder because it implies everything online and you don't get that. But reducing it's not, and the question for us was like, okay, we are all committed. Why didn't we do it? No, and it's like, well, because the institutions are also not pushing us, and we are not thinking. So I'm always happy always to say, okay, think about it. I mean, it's not that you don't have to do it, but if you think about it, you can reduce. And we have institutionalized some protocols at the university, etc. So this part is more like, okay, we can think not only of the research we have and like how publications we have, but also how do we do this research. And with all this is kind of like the last slide. We get to these policies, recommendations on how we need to recognize indigenous people. This was kind of like our main policy recommendation, recognize indigenous people and local communities as legitimate custodians of the knowledge regarding the changes and the impacts, and we have to honor their rights to participate in the decision-making regarding their territory, right? And if you can, I mean, all this is on the web page of the LICCI. You have like the policy brief that we developed and how you can work it out through all the policy plan, to the whole policy, the whole cycle of the policy. And we have brought some of these results and some of these recommendations to several international platforms, no? The IPBES and IPCC, and the International Co-Sponsor Meeting on Cultural Heritage and Climate Change, and the Convention for Safeguarding the Intangible Cultural Heritage. So we have also tried this, bringing it to the, not that they are doing what we say, but at least we tried. And again, just as a recognition of the team that I'm representing here, all the people who participated on that. Thank you.